I want to welcome you to this week's Strategic Overview with Mike Steger. I'm Susan Kokinda. I'll be moderating tonight in place of your usual moderator, Keisha Rogers. Keisha's a little busy this evening. She's at the Texas Republican Party Convention, where she is leading a team of people in a fight to get the Texas Republican Party to adopt a resolution calling for abolishing the Federal Reserve and reestablishing a third national bank of the United States. So the importance of this really can't be overstated, because this is one of the biggest Republican parties in the country, and recruiting the party, or at least a large number of the members of the party, to this fight is going to send a message to people around the country. Since we last met a week ago, I think the week has been characterized more than anything by the disconnect, the growing disconnect between the would-be elites of our country and the world and reality. Right now, I'd say that disconnect is about the size of the Grand Canyon, and it's getting a whole lot wider as the days go forward. Among the singular events of the week, last Tuesday was the California primaries, and we saw the very liberal, soft on crime district attorney for the city of San Francisco get recalled by a vote of at least 55 to 45, as the population of San Francisco, even San Francisco, said, we've had it with crime, we've had it with homelessness. I mean, one of the markers of this situation is that in some period of time, more people have died of fentanyl overdoses in San Francisco than died of COVID. So the people of even liberal San Francisco said enough and booted this guy out. Of course, the big event of the week was the January 6th hearings, which began on Thursday. I frankly think the best continuing coverage of those hearings is coming from the satire publication Babylon Bee. They announced early on Thursday that Miley Cyrus would be performing in the halftime show at the January 6th hearings. And I think viewership dropped the next day on Friday, when a whole lot of people might have tuned in to see Miley Cyrus and realized that it was actually a joke. But their satirical coverage continues, which really does put the right tone to the whole thing. Our own coverage of this was written by Barbara Boyd, and I do want to briefly share the screen with people, because I think she also hit the right tone. Here's her coverage. The January 6th hearing flop. I coulda watched it, but I sold my TV to buy gas. And that says a lot. But what Barbara does in this article, besides going through some of the current activity around this, is once again takes us back to who the real higher level authors of this ongoing coup against our country are. A coup which started even before Donald Trump walked into the White House, even before he was elected. As Barbara goes through in this article, which I really recommend to people, to keep your mind tuned properly to the larger strategic fight that we're engaged in, as opposed to just getting angry and wanting to throw your shoe at your computer or your television screen. What has been orchestrating this from the very get-go is the British imperial elite, by name, as in a sense the command center for what people call the globalists. And she points out not only the well-known fact that we all know, how Russiagate was orchestrated by MI6, not just the lower level Christopher Steele, but higher level people in the British intelligence establishment. But she points especially to the infamous December 2018 report of the British House of Lords, which warned that the British Empire was not going to survive a second Trump administration. And I think it's extremely critical for people to constantly remember what the larger battle is that is being played out on what is apparently the domestic political plane here in the United States. But it is nothing less than a fight between empire and a fight between sovereign nations, as represented by people like Donald Trump, and also represented very eloquently in a speech this week by Russia President Vladimir Putin, who talked about what it takes to ensure that a nation not only has political and strategic sovereignty, but what it takes for a nation to have economic and technological sovereignty. And of course, that has been the focus of our organizing throughout, but particularly now that the reality of an out of control inflationary crisis, an economic disintegration, and a nominally ruling elite, which declares themselves day after day after day to be completely clueless in terms of how to deal with this ongoing crisis. Everything that they are trying, whether it's to whip up the January 6th extravaganza again, or to divert people's attention in other ways, or to act like they have some idea of what to do about inflation, it's all crashing into the rocks of reality. And that reality is that we're in a system which is self-doomed. The imperial central banking system is doomed by virtue of its very nature, by virtue of the fact that it deals only in the shadow world of money and has nothing to do, and often has a negative effect on the real world of physical economy. So while the reality or the unreality TV show of the January 6th hearings is going to continue this week, we will continue to escalate our drive to equip the American people with the ideas, with the policies, with the leadership that we need to deal with the reality of the physical economy. And that is why Keisha is not with us tonight, because as I said, she and her team are at the Texas Republican Convention. We have succeeded in getting before the platform committee a resolution to abolish the Federal Reserve and reestablish Hamilton's third national bank. That resolution was also supported by the Harris County Republican Party, which is the biggest county in Texas. So the next couple of days are going to be a lot of fun with our people on the ground, organizing not just members of the platform committee, but as the actual convention begins on Wednesday, organizing all of the delegates to the Texas Republican Convention. And you can stay tuned to our website for updates on that. The other element of our escalation is the very powerful class, which was delivered by Brian Lance on Saturday night. And once again, I'm going to do a quick screen share. This is our Saturday class series in which Brian is presenting the first of 3 classes on what you might call the practice of national banking. Because what Brian has done, and I'm going to show you one other aspect to this, Brian has produced an extraordinary report, an in-depth report, which looks at various sectors of the US economy. Here's the introduction to it, but I'm going to take you to the report directly. This is not something you're going to read, in 5 minutes. This is something that it is worth devoting however much time it's going to take you to work through these aspects of the report. Because what Brian does is he takes each sector, as you see here, of the US economy, starting with banking and credit, and establishing the basic principles of American system banking and how they would work. And then going through each of the many of the key sectors of the economy, manufacturing, mining, infrastructure, agriculture, and discusses what we do not have in the United States today because of the insane policies, not just of the Biden collective, but of the recent half century. And how a national bank would provide the credit and precisely where that credit needs to go to revive our manufacturing, our mining, our infrastructure, and our agriculture. And I think of particular importance is the last two chapters, Educating Our Youth, in which he discusses the question of how do you reestablish a population which is literate in the real world and is capable of functioning in a productive economy. And also the implications of that for actually reconstructing our broken down cities throughout the United States, as well as creating new cities here, and I might add also on Mars, not too far in the future, we hope. So again, I encourage people to go to our website and begin the process of actually working through that extremely important report. Because while on the one hand, freaking out about inflation and gas prices and lack of goods on the grocery store shelves is certainly understandable in these very frightening times, we have to pull together a cadre of American citizens, whether they are running for office or whether they will be guiding people who are running for office, in the basic principles of how to rebuild our physical economy. So I encourage people to also join us again next Saturday for part 2 of the class series, which will focus on agriculture, but to really devote the time that this report demands, and frankly, that our republic demands, if we're going to have half a chance of getting out of the crisis that we're in today. So with that, I want to turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, welcome everyone. So an intense world. All the reports, I often check the New York Times website just to see what they might be talking about. And after 4 months, or I guess not even 4 months, just a little over 3 months of attempting to create a World War III in Ukraine or some other such trap for the Russian military, have basically admitted near total defeat. Apparently Biden yesterday said something about really it's all Zelensky's fault. So, the senile calling the drug addict, the problem. We're entering so-called bear market, 100 and so many days, 30% collapse of the market value, rising gas prices, all this inflation, all this ideological insanity in the schools. And in reality, as Susan just addressed, though this is a psychotic display by our so-called leaders of our society and civilization, the crisis is actually much deeper. And that goes along with these J6 hearings. So what I want to do tonight is touch on a little bit of, I actually want to take the real crime, or at least the coup de grace of the crime, because the crime was really, as we're talking politically here, a 4-year attempted coup against President Trump that really started before even his election took place soon. It was very active and hot right after the election, perhaps as hot as it could get. At one point, President Trump even called these intelligence agencies or compared them to the Nazis. People may remember that. But use that as a window, and I'm referencing it as N3 because this is a YouTube posting and you've got algorithms, but I think everyone is clear what I'm referencing here. That you had a real crime took place with N3, and what made that possible is the economic destruction of our country. And so as much as it's necessary to take all of the efforts, all of the grassroots engagements, which are really remarkable. I mean, here just in Michigan, which is going to be a major litmus test to how effectively the grassroots can mobilize. We've got candidates endorsed by the Republican Party. Can we now move that into the general election? They're facing challenges on funding because the oligarchs in the state don't want to back the grassroots candidates. So you've got funding questions. All these aspects of, can we fully pull together a fair and effective election? Can we get real candidates across the line that are going to serve the interests, not of a political party, not of a financial class, but of the actual people, in this case, the state of Michigan, but the American people in general? That is a clear question right now that many Americans, many patriots are asking, given what took place on N3. And that, as Trump has said, is the real crime. They're not having hearings or discussions about that. People may tune in as they sip their, Chardonnay and think, the real problem is the working classes of our country, which they think are the problem. When in reality, the problem is quite the opposite. And it is not simply the current economic situation. And in some sense, and it's worth asking this question, why was President Trump such a threat? I think everybody has a quick and immediate answer for that that goes beyond the fact that he was simply disruptive. In some cases, he was going to expose their crimes. Certainly, he was threatening to end their wars. He was committed to the American people again. But to say that, and all of that's true, but it's also worth recognizing we have reached a phase point in the collapse and destruction of our country. And the only way to continue this collapse and destruction is a fascist type control, whether it's dictatorship, a management board run by financial interests, an outright oligarchical type of system. Part of this idea of changing the Constitution, you hear this convention of states stuff. This is largely funded by an oligarchical interest to want to reorganize the nation around direct oligarchical control. Like you see with the European Union. It's a good example of what oligarchical bureaucracy looks like, where you have elections, but they have no meaning, because a management board called the European Union, which has these heads of states of sorts, actually manage every aspect of the society with some kind of parliamentary consent, with no national interest. But there's a deep crisis. They can't continue what they're doing. And this is what Lyndon LaRouche was very clear on. The only way they can execute their ultimate plan of destruction of the country is that. What Trump brought to bear was not only in opposition to that plan, which he certainly had and certainly saw. Many of us saw it with Obama. Trump saw it, he responded. But he also brought to bear a deeper acknowledgement of how we move out of this acceptance, a cultural acceptance of fascism or globalism, really, because it can manifest in terms of a Bolshevik communism, a fascism. I mean, there's similar types of oligarchical systems that put their boot on the heel of the average citizen for a slave labor, cheap labor policy. Trump saw that there is an instinct or impulse or tradition in the United States that was of an industrial quality. This is what the British smelled. This is why they wrote the report. They can't handle a Trump second term, because if the United States returns to that quality of industrial American system program, then it will make it available to all other nations. Nations in Africa, like Nigeria or Egypt, nations like Pakistan. It's developing in India under Modi, nations even in Europe, Italy, potentially France, certainly Hungary, Russia and China, Brazil, Argentina, even Mexico, to move hard against the drug cartels and their financial and globalist controllers. Trump's revival of that in the United States, this American economic agenda, what LaRouche PAC is laying out in depth with Brian Lance's new report, threatens to revive that through nations around the world. And that makes their imperial or globalist system untenable. It's an existential threat for them. And it's this economic question that far too almost zero, maybe Peter Navarro and a few other people in Washington had any inkling. And you can see why Peter Navarro has been targeted. Had any inkling at all of what Trump was trying to do on the trade deals, on manufacturing, on industry. And so maybe more in the population, why Trump would have 50 or 60,000 people at his rallies was because there was this impulse within that working class, within people who recognize nature is not something to romanticize, it's something to conquer through industry, science, trades, skills, real knowledge. You can't just simply live off iPhones, computer programming and lattes. A sexual relationship, a procreative family is not hinged upon pornography or other perverse sexual identities. You have to ask the question today, just as a reflection, how many people interested in abortion rights are even engaged or ever plan to be engaged in procreative sexual activity? I mean, it's just a theoretical issue for them. The whole thing has become so perverse. That's why it's collapsed in terms of support, because the people that are so neurotic to buy into it any longer, in terms of abortion as a right, aren't even engaged in the idea of having children or a future. So Trump brought this instinct out, and the productive classes, the so-called flyover country, they have a sense of Trump's economics, but there wasn't a mobilization. There wasn't an army. There's an army now in response to N3. We need an army. And that army, as General MacArthur recognized after World War I, when he took over West Point, requires officers. It requires people who understand how we think about economy, not simply by stopping the crisis. Look, part of this crisis, and Brian addressed this on Saturday night to some extent on speculation, is the fact that Biden's senility and the incompetence of this entire regime has left such uncertainty to the entire economy in terms of investments, stability, what's going to happen. The level of chaos that could unfold is so severe under this current system of leadership that the whole market unravels. Having President Trump in there right now, tomorrow, would immediately calm things down, but it wouldn't solve the underlying crisis. Trump wants to. We, the American people, are going to have to impose that with pitchforks and all the rest upon the political class in our states, in our counties, and certainly in Washington. That's a revolution in American political culture. And it is that line, the fight in the Republican Party to make it a vehicle for the development of the nation, as Lincoln did it in its creation, hinges upon eliminating this globalist rhino kind of oligarch finance program and class from any hegemony over the Republican Party, that it's devoted to an economic program, which of course will benefit people with financial interests. We're going to grow as a country. We're going to develop. If you have wealth, it will grow. But it's not to serve that class. It is to serve the interest of the broad swath of all of the American people. That's what we talk about in terms of a difference between a central banking, which serves the interests of a moneyed class, and a national banking system, which serves the interests of the productivity of the nation and its future. So this is why this question and this fight around an economy is such a critical factor of LaRouche PAC and our operation. and why we know we have to build an army to support President Trump's return. And it has to happen now in the midst of this growing crisis. And this is probably not even comparable to 2008. It's far more severe. The instability is far greater. The uncertainty of this regime is far higher. They just spent 3 months with a potential threat of world war. We spent $50 billion, more than the budget for the US Army, more than the entire budget of the government of Ukraine. And this regime is already conceding we've probably lost. And we said this back in early March, Zelensky himself should be personally concerned. As soon as his usefulness is gone, he should be very concerned. He may want to quickly find refuge in Russia, where he's probably safer there than he is in the hands of this Western globalist system. And there's a lot of Russian oligarchs that learned that lesson, likely poisoned by MI6 and the like when they took residence in London. Okay, so in terms of how does the N3 crime point to the deeper corruption and destruction of our country? Well, many of you may have seen 2000 Mules. And it's an excellent demonstration with very rigorous vetted material, which I think is going to be expanded. I think they're going to bring more to bear. The reports are this grouping True the Vote and others that are working with this network are going to bring even more material to bear on how they plan on using things like the charities, the 501c3s to expand the voter corruption in the coming elections. But it documents, and there have been recent cases, even in Georgia, the federal government has admitted that yes, Dominion machines do have major security issues. The federal government has admitted this based on certain court cases in Georgia. In Georgia, an election in DeKalb County showed there was an election for county commissioner, Democrats in a primary, and a Democrat who ended up third after the machines counted the votes called for a recount by hand, and after the recount, they came in first, and the person who came in first came in third. So the idea that Bill Barr and these other butt sniffers of the oligarchs think that they can continue to try to placate and play nice and not admit that they were grossly in error, if not malice in their deception following the election. The evidence is overwhelming that our elections, especially for the number of aspects that have been pointed to, were certainly there. Now, that doesn't mean that there were a lot of specific red herrings. I mean, it was like a Catholic fish fry in Lent, the amount of red herrings that were throwing out there by intelligence agencies and agents to mislead, distract, and undermine the credibility of the claims, to create these salacious claims with demagogues who are kind of promoting them. But nonetheless, the evidence is staggering. But as one person, I mean, as we all know, in some ways you could say it was 6 counties. And I would say it would actually, when we look at it from a more national standpoint, it was actually far greater. Those 6 counties were the counties which included the cities of Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Phoenix, Milwaukee. What am I forgetting? Maybe was it Las Vegas? So, but many of those cities, especially Milwaukee, Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, had been major cities, especially within the first half of the 20th century, some cases earlier. And they were built up around an industrial and productive process. If you take a state like New York, upstate New York is generally rural, industrial, farmland, natural resources abundant, and yet it's dominated politically by New York City. Much is true of our entire nation. You look at California, most of the territory is red. Just like most of the country's territory is red politically in terms of being a conservative or Republican and certainly pro-Trump. But we've got these cities which have become so dominant. And it was those cities and those political corrupt machines in those cities which led to the ability to create the N3 scenario. Well, and in some ways, we now look at our cities like the south side of Chicago. Of course, Chicago and Illinois is another clear case. And we see it just violence, chaos, the gun violence and deaths, the drug addiction, the homelessness of our cities. And the city itself has become something of a terror zone, where you walk into a city today and you feel as if you're surrounded by viable threats. It's a state of high anxiety. And many of the people that live in these cities, some cases for generations, are in some ways, they're not, maybe there's some are stuck. Some are there because their families, both their parents, grandparents, children, and grandchildren, their social environments, their religious communities are within these areas. So you just can't, people just aren't all just going to get up and leave. But why have our cities, how have they become like this? Many of us know, and there are a number of books. One is Dreamland, that documented the specific targeting of the drug cartels in Mexico with heroin, targeting former industrial areas, mostly in rural places like the Kentucky-Ohio River area, but places throughout the country, former industrial towns where pain pill addiction had taken place. They would literally go outside methadone locations where former industrial families, now with their children, with a loss of economic viability, breakdowns of families, increased drug addiction or painkiller addiction because of football injuries or sports industries or other injuries at work, but would lead to an addiction. And then heroin dealers run by international criminal operations were then deploy into these niches. And so we have this massive drug and what's the drug now? I just slipped the name. We all know that the drug, basically the horse, pain pill, fentanyl, are devastating these rural areas. And we think of the pull out of the industrial production of places like, certainly the Ohio River area is a key location. It's also true in the Northeast, and many of these former industrial areas. And it's really throughout the country. And we identify this as part of the globalization dynamic that became dominant, certainly in the late 80s and by early 90s, was a dominant trend of taking industrial production out of our country. Trump identified this, like 30,000 factories were pulled out of the country. I mean, just a staggering number of actual factories pulled out and moved to places for cheap labor, whether it was China, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, Mexico, and the maquiladoras just south of the border. This was the whole NAFTA agenda, a cheap labor agenda. And this is what Trump was working to reverse. And many of us identify this because it has affected, to a large extent, that flyover country. This area that is predominantly conservative, Republican, pro-Trump, in these non-city, more rural farmland and industrial centers. But in reality, the places that were first targeted for total destruction were the cities. Now, this is to be continuous with our discussion last week, where it's an ancient tradition of building up cities as a viable parts of it, creating a sense of civilization. This was the major means of Greek expansion of civilization throughout the Mediterranean, up into the Black Sea, throughout the Ionian coast of what's today Western Turkey, moving west, as far west as Marseille, France, Sicily, southern Italy, and even the North African coast. And this would have only continued. This was the distinction of building up these advanced cities against what was more like the barbarian trends of just tribal developments and more kind of agricultural, but a less concentration, a less sense of actual science and technology within the culture. You know, you think of a city, you think of Athens, you think of Syracuse and Sicily. These were built, and they were built with an ability for an industrial capacity. They might have been located on rivers for fresh water, on ocean areas for trade, commerce, and fishing. They would be built with the idea of natural resources, of some cases timber, or mining capabilities, or clay for pottery. And they would actually become, to some degree, autonomous. They would be reliant upon trade and commerce to some degree, but the ability to supply a great majority of what was needed for daily use within the population would be met by that population as a skilled artisan, tradesman, and crafts, the ability to produce what was necessary in terms of food supply, breads, processed foods, not just the raw flour, but the ability to provide for thousands or tens of thousands of people within a city area. A far more organized and concentrated place, and within that industrial capacity, within that productive ability, within that environment, you built up then the city structure, city defenses, more advanced, dense housing capabilities, and you created an ability for a flourishing of culture. We think of, in some ways, classical Greek tragedy. That doesn't happen in a more low populated, spread out population. It happens within a concentration of populations where the creative resources, the appeal to more profound questions of culture and art can touch the population and be receptive. The same is true with the United States. Much of New York, as much as it was a leading center of trade and commerce, became such a key area because it was connected to the other parts of the country, like the Great Lakes region with the Erie Canal. And it was built up as an industrial center. You don't create dense populations of people just for the sake of creating dense populations. This current Democratic Party, liberal, globalist, Davos approach, we're going to build high-rise apartments or big block apartment buildings in the middle of nowhere with no economic activity, no industrial program, a bunch of kids programming with work at home, with pot shops all over the place, and think that you're somehow going to support the population in any reasonable way. Every town and city in our country started with a viable economic question: farming, mining, fishing, manufacturing, industrial process. They were built and started from that standpoint. And within that context, you built up housing that made it easy to both live a clean, effective family life and at the same time meet the demands. And there were constant improvements, as we all know, because many times these things would become slums, but there'd be improvements in infrastructure, improvements in development, a rising standard of living that made it possible for people to go from their place of living to their place of work in an effective way. And of course, there were options to move outside of cities, but the idea was to make these cities an effective place. In the 1950s, New York City was an effective place. It had advanced transit, advanced water supplies, extensive electricity and power supplies. It developed a certain level of housing. In some cases, and I just spent a weekend there, it's part of, reconsidering some of these questions. Much of the housing in places like Brooklyn was built in the 1870s and 1880s. It's built over 150 years ago. Brick or stone, what they call brownstone housing, 2-3 story flats, single family or multi-generational housing. It's dense, but it's incredibly beautiful. If that housing is located to nearby productive centers of employment, so you spend 10 minutes getting to work and 10 minutes getting home, this becomes a viable enterprise. If the city is to a large extent autonomous, and that the people involved are responsible for reproducing the daily activity of that city and making it possible. This was true up until about 1970, and certainly was decimated by 1980. Just to give you a sense, in 1940, 40%, 2 out of every 5 New Yorkers were engaged in manufacturing and production. 2 out of every 5 employed. In 1950, it was still 30%, 3 out of 10. There were 8 million people in New York in 1950. There are 8 million people in New York today. There were 1 million people involved in production and manufacturing in 1950. And people go, well, what were they involved in? Food processing? How about lubricants, oils, paints, different kinds of machines, cash registers, pumps, all the requirements that go into those machines, electronic components, clothing, steel, furniture, textiles. I mean, they produced everything that largely the city needed. And they had largely the raw materials either from upstate New York, from New Jersey, which was a garden state of large food supply, or they had even broader raw materials. You know, the old story of building the Empire State Building, the steel was so hot coming from Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh. It was so fresh that you could actually, it was still hot from the furnace when it got to New York City to be built, because all of the industrial capabilities of the Great Lakes, the iron, the coal supply, the steel capability shipped on the Erie Canal or by rail, was part of an integrated dynamic of the city as a whole. But the city also produced a lot of the required goods. So 1 million people in 1950 were still engaged in this. And this isn't unique to New York. This is Detroit. This is Chicago. This is Los Angeles, Long Beach. Those were the 4 most productive places in the country just 75 years ago. 70 years ago. Those 4 places were the heartbeat of American industrial production. What's happened to those cities? They've been destroyed. In some cases with Detroit, the auto plants moved out of the city. Things like the River Rouge, which were outside in Dearborn, were broken up and split up. It was no longer where raw materials came in and cars came out, which was what it was when Ford had initially developed it. Detroit's been depopulated by over 1 million people. It's now beginning to the point where it's under threshold to even support the infrastructure costs that are required to keep the water and sewage and power running. In New York today, the same amount of people live there. In 1950, 1 million people were involved in some form of manufacturing and production. There was stable income, low inflation. It was getting worse, but it was still low compared to today. Today, there are only 75,000 people involved in production in New York, and there are still 8 million people. We wonder how these areas, which would only have ever been built and become such places of population residence from the standpoint of the productive potential of the area. And we're certainly turned into that through the late 19th and early 20th century industrial development of the United States, have been left to languish in a culture or a cult of drug addiction, a loss of basic moral and creative values. And many of these people have just been left entrapped there. By 1975, New York was driven into bankruptcy The bankers plunged it into bankruptcy. They plunged it into massive debt. They basically gave them infinite credit supply to run up a huge, massive budget, then squeezed them, choked them off, plunged them into bankruptcy. And the city was nearly totally destroyed as a criminal, drug-infested, broke down, homeless, unemployment crisis, where they're starting to burn buildings and create arson for real estate speculation, which eventually gets cleaned up in the 1990s under hard policing. But it's been destroyed. And we go, how did these cities run this election corruption? Because they've been devastated for over 50 years. Because drugs have been pumped into them like they've been pumped into the Midwest and other industrial towns, former industrial towns in the so-called Rust Belt, which is a horrible pejorative. They were pumped into the cities even earlier, and the deindustrialization, post-industrialization hit those locations first and foremost, almost right after World War II. If you look at the map of manufacturing in New York City, by 1960, it just rapidly plummets down. This is what we let happen. The only way you're going to be able to address this question of political stability in our country is to recognize this has been done to all of our population. Yes, we've turned these cities into kind of bizarre cult centers where now they import a bunch of liberals from these, that have been brainwashed in colleges that come in and think they can live the great life of New York City. But to a large extent, it's the residents who have been the bedrock of that city, which are the ones we have to actually take concern for. Same is true in Detroit, Chicago, Oakland, California. Oakland was built as an industrial city around Kaiser shipyards, and the Kaiser hospitals were built off of that dynamic. As soon as World War II ends, those are gone, and the population is left to languish, increasingly in poverty. Now, what Lyndon LaRouche addressed this at the time and says, we have to maintain the industrial capability in these cities. Now it's all justified under environmentalism. There's so many regulations and rules and diktats and the financing and ESG that it almost seems impossible to bring manufacturing to these places. And maybe we don't bring them there first, but if we don't have a dedication to reindustrialize these locations and provide a means of the people who have stuck it out a chance to regain a sense of dignity in work and production and independence from the slime of this financial system, which is what most of them end up serving, whether it's in food service or sanitation or whatever it is. Most people, Uber drivers, this kind of thing, you're serving an oligarchical financier and rentier interest. They own everything, you own nothing, you rent everything, and you serve them by making the best cupcakes or something like that, which is what a lot of bizarre people in their 30s, millennials, find somehow to be a creative job. Making cupcakes is just not creative. I don't care how decorative they might be. It's sweet, it may be a nice thing to do. It's not a creative field. It's certainly not the field of an American citizen building civilization. We don't need servants to an oligarchy. We need productive Americans. And that's not just in the areas that were productive up and through the recent 30 years or 40 years ago. These cities used to be the powerhouses. It was James Brown. People know Jim Brown, the great Cleveland Browns running back. He was involved in Los Angeles politically, still may be. Part of the reasons the gangs festered in Los Angeles and Long Beach, which became the center for a lot of this insane hip hop and drug and prostitute and whore and pimp culture that's promoted today in these city centers. They used to be a major center of auto manufacturing. They were ripped out in the 1950s. And the people that had those jobs were left to fend for themselves. No replacement. What are you going to do? Set up a liquor store and replace the manufacturing production? It doesn't work. We are responsible to make sure, as a national government, that our citizens have the opportunity to be productive and to support the livelihood of our society and the future. That means building the infrastructure, but it means also building the manufacturing capabilities that sustain a viable society and economy. This has to happen. You can't just have investments into city areas that are real estate speculations. Make some nice hotels and some restaurants and make it a place to go, Romanize the cities. That's not a bad thing. It's not without its merits. But you don't have and can't fulfill the cultural, emotional, and spiritual interest of a population if they don't have some means to employ their talents in something morally necessary for society's success. The breakdown of churches, the breakdown of culture. People need a responsibility. Manufacturing industry is the means to contribute something in an organized and effective social process. So, and if we do it effectively, as we did in places like Brooklyn, where there are these beautiful brownstones, you can provide a good quality of life with dense urban living, not in slums, not in these horrible project buildings that should have never been built and should be razed to the ground today. And we should build manufacturing facilities there, and we should build actual forms of real physical employment. But if we're going to pull this nation together, it's this kind of consideration that will annihilate, that will end this liberal tyranny once and for all. To make this kind of real proposal to build our country, to rebuild our cities from the standpoint of a manufacturing base. And if that has to be low-skilled manufacturing to start, so be it. We'll have to work towards advanced manufacturing. We're going to have to do all of this in parallel. Bring in what skill level you can meet or what you can train. Bring in the security levels necessary to secure the operations, because we've turned these things into cultural death zones in some regards, with a lot of security issues, legalizing drugs. But we're going to have to marshal our entire nation, much like the small towns in the Midwest or in the South, where a lot of the textile was moved from the Northeast, and places in the Northeast which have industrial potential. We're going to have to start to rebuild our nation. This is what Brian kind of discussed with the strategic plan on Saturday. He'll do it again this Saturday. But you can see how these cities have been turned into agencies of destruction of our nation itself, like with N3, when in reality, they're the ultimate victim of this globalization, globalist agenda. We are going to rectify that. That's what Make America Great is. That's what this MAGA movement is. And in doing so, we are going to begin to restore the foundations of our civilization. And I don't think anything less can be accepted. If that is the Republican platform, if that is the commitment of our nation and its people in this political movement, we are going to pull together real political power in this country. And so I think that's worth discussing. And I'm sure people have some thoughts regarding these questions. Looks like people have jumped into the queue. So I guess Susan will jump in and see what's happening.